Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Outliers YouTube channel and podcast series and our program, Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm your host, DP Lyle, and I am here with my partner today, Dr. Catherine Ramsland. Catherine, welcome,
Hi, glad to be here again.
as always. And today we have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful interview by a great guy who we've known for a long time. Catherine's really known him a long time, but Mark Safarik. Mark, welcome.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it. I'm
Yeah,
glad to be here.
yeah. Well, Mark is a supervisor, was a supervisor special agent with the FBI for years, and ended up in the behavioral assessment unit. So he's the guy that did the profiling, though I understand that word's not used anymore, but it's a behavioral assessment, which probably makes more sense. But you were in law enforcement for over 3 decades. So tell us what led you to that, and how did you get involved? What stages did you go through to end up at all the way at the FBI?
Right. I mean, it was a really interesting journey. I had no idea I was going to be in law enforcement. I didn't. It wasn't something I aspired to going through college. I was looking to get into veterinary school, and I got out. I was applying. My GPA was good. It just wasn't good enough. And I didn't get in the first year. So I thought, well, I keep my hand in this arena, medical arena. So I became a paramedic on an ambulance, which put me in contact with police on a daily basis, and shootings and stabbings and, all kinds of violent crimes, car accidents. And I started to see the type of work that they did, and I found it interesting, and I'd see them at the hospitals when they were interviewing witnesses and victims. And so I went on one of those ride-along programs. They used to, I don't know if they still do those in agencies, but I went on a ride-along program, and most people ride once and, ride with a police officer for a shift and then it's done. But I kept going back. I mean, I went back like 8, 10 times. And then the sergeant I was riding with said, "Hey, you should become a reserve police officer," which I did. Put myself through the Sacramento County Sheriff's Reserve Academy, and became a reserve officer, worked a two-man unit for a long time. And then was able to take a unit by myself. So I just really loved it. I loved the work. I love the interesting aspects of, assisting the community. And then I just decided that, that was where my career should head, in the direction of law enforcement. So I applied to be an officer with the Davis, California Police Department, and I got hired, and I worked patrol for like 3.5 years, and then I had a college education, so back then that was, it was a thing, right? Because I could write reports in an articulate way, uh, and so. I wanted to be in investigations. I promoted into detectives, started in property crimes, ended in violent crimes. And it was at that time I went to this was like 1982. I went to a homicide school, and we had two FBI profilers, Russ Vorpagel and Roy Hazelwood, who came to give us, this was a 2-week school, came to give us 2 days of sort of instruction on behavioral analysis, behavioral assessment. And I was absolutely mesmerized by this completely different way of looking at violent crime. And so I had a couple of homicide cases that were unsolved cases that I was working, and I thought I should submit them to the FBI's unit. Back then, it was called the Behavioral Sciences Unit. And that's what started my interaction with the FBI in Sacramento, submitting my cases and then working with the profilers back at Quantico. And, after like a year, I just decided that is what I really wanted to do. It was just a fascinating way of looking at these complex violent crimes. And I applied to the Bureau. Took me like a year to get in. Um, and then I spent 11 years, moving around. I first went to the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming, where I worked all the violent crimes for like 3.5 years, and then to the New York office. And I was a coordinator there for violent crimes, and then to the Sacramento division. And eventually there were some openings in the behavioral unit, and I applied, and I got in. And that was where I wanted to be. I was about 40 by this time in the bureau, so when people come to me, young students in college, and like, how do I become an FBI profiler? I'm like, well, I got into the unit when I was 40 years old. And for them, it's like a lifetime. You're talking to them,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
They can't see that far out, right? They're 19, 20 years old, and you're going, yeah, in 20 years, you might be able to get into the unit if you're fortunate. But I was in the unit, and I loved the work. It was so challenging, and I tried to absorb as much as I could. I started doing research in the second year I was in the unit, in sexual assault and murder of elderly women. And I've published extensively in this particular area, book chapters and journal articles. And I spent over half of my FBI career in the behavioral analysis unit. And in 2007, I was contacted by Bob Bressler, who I knew from my original days of submitting my cases to the unit, who asked me if I would join him as his partner in forensic behavioral services. I had been eligible to retire, but I really loved the work, so I just stayed. And then that offer was too good to be true for me, and so I retired from the bureau after 23 years and 7 years in local law enforcement, and joined Bob Ressler. And at the time, of course, Bob was sick, but we didn't realize how fast his condition was progressing. And literally within 6 months, he was not able to do cases anymore. So, under his tutelage, I took over and started doing casework, much the same type of cases that I did when I was in the unit. Although I did more cases for civil attorneys, but almost always involving violent crimes. And now I have Bob passed away about 6 years after that in 2013, and I just had my 18th anniversary as having been the president of this company. So I feel extremely fortunate. I'm still publishing. I'm currently working with several co-authors, um, Matt DeLisi and Oliver Chan and Wade Myers, on a new book on sexual homicide, which we hope to have published by, or at least finished by the end of next year. Um, so still doing TV work and still doing
Yeah.
casework, consultations and expert testimony work on a slew of different types of cases. And yeah, I still find the work very rewarding and very interesting. And I get to work with great people like Catherine. I've lectured for her up at DeSales, and we have published articles together, and we have a book together. So she's wonderful. And I love working with people like Catherine, who are at the top of their field. And and the cases that I work on, and the attorneys that I work for, and law enforcement experts, and law enforcement agencies, it's been a very fulfilling life and very rewarding, and I'm grateful that I can still do it.
Well, I think a lot of people, they think they understand the behavioral assessment unit and the old
Yes.
BSU and all that, and they think they understand what you do. But mostly it's like the TV show, somebody puts their hand out and feels something. But that's not how it works. And, everybody
No.
with a brain knows that. So whether if you were doing it with the FBI back in the day or with your new gig that you're doing now, your new company, not so new now, but your
Not
company,
so new. Right.
let's say, what is the process if someone contacts you and say, we need an analysis of this situation from a
Right.
behavioral point of view? What's the process in general that you would go through?
So, the first thing I do is I evaluate the type of case that they're asking me to look at, because really where my focus is in these complex, really unusual types of violent crimes. So most of the homicide cases and violent crime cases don't really fall into that category. So, I triage, the information that they're giving me to see if I can really be of assistance in the case. whether it's a law enforcement agency or whether it's a civil attorney that has a violent crime case. And this is true now, and it was true when I was in the unit. I have a process for how I evaluate a case. And it's sort of I would say it's a microanalysis of the complexities of the case. So I start with victimology, and I try to gather as much information as I can about the victim to really understand why this particular individual was targeted in this violent crime. And when you look at victimology, you look at their history and their background in lots of different areas, and what their risk level is and what level of risk the offender is willing to engage in order to assault this victim. It can give you some really interesting information about perhaps the relationship dynamic that exists. And then I look at other things like injuries, and I've published on injuries. I have a homicide injury scale that I developed and have published on in various journals. So injury is very important to me. What is the weapon? How many injuries do they have? Where are they located? What types of injuries are they? Are they superficial? Are they defensive? Are they fatal injuries? Where are they inflicted? How many of them are there? So injuries are important. And then other aspects like MO, ritualized or need-driven behavior within the scene, other activity that's going on at the scene. How did the offender get into the scene and get out of the scene, or get to the scene and get away from the scene? Any level of planning or organization that I see. So there's all these various components that I look at when I look at a case, and mostly what I'm really interested in, and this is, I think, an area that people who, sort of the general public, when they think of profiling or, the behavioral assessment, they think we're profiling people. Like,
Right.
What's your profile of this person?
Right.
But in truth, what we're really doing is profiling behavior, because what we get, is the crime scene. We get this complex, difficult to understand um, behavioral maelstrom of all kinds of activity. And you have to decipher what is going on and what things happened in both a chronological way and in a temporal way, that makes sense, because your job or my job is to explain that in a way that makes sense, and essentially to tell the story of how these events unfolded and why, right? And that's not hard to do when it's a very sort of simplistic crime. And that's why generally I don't work those types of cases, and they're not cases that are really amenable. They're not good cases for behavioral assessment, because there isn't enough what I would call psychopathology within the scene itself. Even though a detective who's investigating a homicide might think that this scene, this case is complex for them, um, by the standard that I look at, it's not, right? And so I'm looking at cases where you have a lot of violence, you have a lot of time spent at the scene, you have a lot of other activity going on. And deciphering that is the challenge, right? And I will do that for law enforcement or for other attorneys, even private parties. Sometimes I get contacted by a private party about a case, typically a family member that either died in some way, was murdered, or where it's not clear what happened, like an equivocal death. So I use the same process, and I'm really evaluating everything attendant to the scene, what occurred before, during, and after the scene. Things that happen months or years later, I'm not really interested in that. Because that information generally does not reflect on the scene, which is why when police agencies investigate detectives investigate a homicide, the ability to do a remarkable job on the crime scene, both in documenting it and collecting evidence. Like right now, I'm working on a case that is 35 years old,
Wow.
and there's no victimology, and there's like 30 pictures, right? It's very difficult, and those were pictures taken with film cameras, right? So now, it's no problem to knock down 400 or 500 photographs of a crime scene. But those early cases, detectives are dead, witnesses are gone and dead. The crime scene, which was a row house, is a parking lot now. It got knocked down like 20 years ago, so there's no crime scene to go back to. So trying to reconstruct cases like that, it's difficult. So the better the crime scene, and the more it's preserved, the easier it is for me. And that's what I tell people. Look, if the crime scene was frozen and done well, documented both in photographs and in diagrams and aerial photographs, and the area around it was documented, and forensic evidence was tested, and we have those tests and all. I don't, it doesn't matter if that case is a year old or 10 years old or 20 years old, because that information doesn't change. And that's the information that I'm using, and that initial investigation that was conducted by those detectives or those police officers. Um, that information is still the same information. So it's just that in really old cases, they tended to not, you know, we don't process crime scenes quite the same way, in the 70s and 80s and early 90s as we do now. Not forensically. And of course, we didn't know about DNA back then, really. And even in 1990, the FBI was just starting to use DNA, and we had to have large quantities
Right,
of it and
exactly.
such. But yeah, I would say I do, and I have been for my entire career, looking at cases the same way and trying to maintain. And I had this problem when I was in the unit, and it taught me lessons about thinking what you've got without really exploring the data. And so, I mean, I think Sherlock Holmes said it great. He said, insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts, right? So sometimes we look at something, we think we've seen it before and we know what it is, and then we develop that theory. Now that becomes a problem, because now you're trying to, when you look at the facts or the information that you uncovered, your data, then you're trying to sort of work that into your theory, which is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing.
Right, exactly.
So I had problems in a couple of cases, and I learned. So I try to be extremely objective when I get case material. I start, from the very beginning, without any, as much as I can, without any preconceived notions about what I'm dealing with.
Well, there's the same problem in medicine. We call it tunnel
Yeah.
vision. You gotta look at what's before you. You got to gather all the data, and then what makes the most sense here. And that's why I think anybody in any profession, their most valuable asset is common sense. In the
Yeah.
South, we call it walking around sense. If you got walking around sense, you're going to be okay in whatever you decide to do. If you don't, you're gonna work hard to get anywhere. Well, along what you were talking about there, I'm assuming that when you get called to a case, they either have a situation that is unusual, bizarre, something they can't quite get their head around, and they don't really have a suspect. They don't really know which direction to turn, or they have a suspect, but they want to make sure they're going in the right direction. Do you get involved in both of those? And if so, how do you often end up saying, well, I like the fact that you're looking at this guy, but that ain't the guy. I don't think that's the guy.
Yeah, yeah. I've had those situations, both those, and even currently, I get involved in those situations. I mean, when I testify as an expert witness in court, in a criminal trial, clearly a defendant has been arrested, right?
Right.
And I'm always aware that there is somebody in custody for this crime. But, and that's why I'm very careful when I testify, because typically that defendant is not part of the scene, right? They weren't there. Now, sometimes they are, as they put themselves there as a witness. But then I only treat them as a witness. Really, the scene, I have to explain the scene, absent this individual, as the dynamics of what's going on here. If I've got ritualized behavior, or if I have staging behavior or undoing behavior, depersonalization, proprietary interest, um, all of those dynamics, if I see them within a crime, I have to be able to recognize them and then define them and explain that to a jury of people who have no idea what that stuff is, and to a judge, right? But I stay in my lane, right? And I'm only addressing what is attendant to the scene. And typically, the defendant or suspect in the case is not, right? And so I'm very focused on the dynamic within what's going on with the victim and the scene and that sort of thing. So, but I've dealt with both, and honestly, I've had many cases. Um, One case stands out in particular. It was a mass murder case in Wales, and they formed a task force in this case, and it was a 75-man task force. And they had been working this case for a year, could not get it solved. So they came over. This is when I was in the bureau. And so they came over and they talked to us, spent 2 days with us going over this mass murder of a grandmother, her daughter, and then the daughter's two young girls. It was really horrific. It was a horrific mass murder. And it was the worst one that Wales had seen in 25 years. But the detectives got focused on suspects, on multiple suspects. And in the consultation, when we were done, and then at the end of the consults, when we asked them, okay, do you have suspects? And let's talk about suspects. When they brought up these suspects, I'm looking at my colleagues who are with me, and we're going, yeah, it's not these people, right? This is a single offender crime, not multiple offenders. And your offender is much younger than the suspects you're looking at. But you see, they weren't really interested. What they were interested in was for us to affirm the direction that they had been moving this case for a year. They were committed, right? This is that group think sort of mentality, right? Where nobody wants to say, like, we've been working this case for a year and here's where we're going. Nobody wants to go, say, oh, excuse me, perhaps we're going in the wrong direction, right? Well, that's what we said. And they're very nice, said, thank you very much. And they left. And we wrote a very detailed report because we knew that they were having a lot of problems with it. And we laid it all out in the report. But, and a year later, they ended up arresting a single suspect who was quite a bit younger. And I'm not saying that, we're right every time, but in this case we were, but they just were unwilling to see it, just did not want to listen to what we had to say. And I've experienced that many times in the unit, and other agencies they're like sponges because they don't know, right? Even as an example, even in my research on sexual homicides of elderly females, I worked a case out of Detroit with a homicide detective who was seasoned. I mean, this guy had 400 homicides under his belt. He was a very, very good homicide investigator, but he just had never seen anything like this. A 93-year-old woman stabbed, in the genitalia, in the chest, nude. I mean, just he'd worked homicides, lots of them, but this one flummoxed him. He didn't understand what it was he was looking at, right? But I had looked at hundreds and hundreds of these and researched them and published. And when I talked to him on the phone, I hadn't seen anything related to the crime scene. But my offenders from the research I knew were a very homogeneous group of people, regardless of race or age. And I said, this is what I think you should be looking for. And after a couple of weeks, they identified a guy that just fit this to the T. And he ended up being the guy. And then Dave Wirtz and I ended up writing an article together about that. The intersection of really good investigative work, behavioral analysis, and the forensic evidence component, how you put those three things together and how they make a really strong case. So, I mean, it's gone both ways.
Where is
Cool.
that published?
I'll send it to you.
Yeah, I'd like to see it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
How many articles have you published now? I mean, Catherine's like 6 million.
Yeah,
yeah,
I can't.
yeah. She's the
I'm not even
Energizer
in the
Bunny. I
same
know.
league. I'm not even in the same ballpark as Catherine. I'm somewhere down in the mid-Atlantic. I don't.
Exactly.
You know, I don't know. Maybe like 20,
Yeah.
25 journal articles and 10 book chapters.
Mhm.
So
Well, you also
yeah,
wrote a book with Catherine
we did.
about spree killers. Uh, and why don't we talk a little bit about that, the both of you, uh, as to how this came about and what it's all about, and et cetera.
Yeah, it was an interesting story because we didn't set out
Yeah.
to write a book. This actually came out of this symposium where and Mark was one of the organizers, where the FBI decided to eliminate spree killer as a category. So Mark, maybe you want to talk about that, because then it was a case that Mark and I both saw at the same time. And then
Right.
we just
Yeah.
kept building and building. But go ahead with the symposium. You can tell that story.
So there was a lot of discussion about serial killers, right? And how we defined them. And there were a lot of law enforcement agencies that were like, well, why does the FBI, why are they in charge of defining what serial murder is? And this was a problem that, we were facing worldwide. Agencies questioning, like, well, what is the definition of serial murder? We have a different definition, and other researchers had definitions. So what we thought we would do is we would host a symposium, and we would invite 140 of the world's experts in serial murder. And this was task force commanders, law enforcement individuals, suicidologists, psychiatrists. We were trying academics. We wanted to get a lot of different opinions about this. And we hosted that symposium in 2005 in San Antonio, Texas. And it was a week long. And the Bureau paid for everything, for everybody, to fly people from around the world to this symposium and put them up. And because we were really interested in, like, let's talk about serial murder. Let's talk about its etiology. Let's talk about the offenders. Let's talk about prosecutions. Let's talk about investigations, and let's talk about definitions. These were all things that were being discussed over the 5 days. And one of the areas was, in this discussion of serial murder, was this whole cooling off period. I never liked it because it wasn't ever defined. And in that discussion, when the new definition of serial murder was proposed, the term cooling off was taken out. Well, at the time, the term cooling off was really the only thing that separated serial murder from spree murders. So now the people at the symposium said, do we really need spree murder, right? We should just have serial murder, because we can define that in mass murder, but I don't, spree murder goes away. And that was not something that I thought should go away because I thought there was a category for spree murder. So that sort of, you know, I was overruled because this was, this was a lot of people making these decisions. But then I was up with Catherine up at DeSales, and we were having dinner one night because I was lecturing up there. And there was a case, the Dwight Lamont Jones case out of Phoenix. And it was in the news, and Catherine and I were discussing it because it was a spree murder, right? The way we looked at it.
Very
But
clearly.
but the interesting thing about this case was that police were able to, with information that was provided, were able to intercept Jones before, because he had a literally a hit list of people. They were able to intercept Jones because of because someone recognized the connections between the different people that were getting killed. And we thought, that's interesting because typically law enforcement is always in a reactive mode in serial murder. Like once we recognize we have serial murder, we're trying to identify the killer. Right, Catherine?
Right.
We're always behind the eight ball. And in mass murder, we're basically arriving most of the time by the time the event is over, right? So that in mass murder, the guy's either suicided or he's had, law enforcement kill him, or sometimes he's captured. But generally, most of the event's over. We're again in a reactive position. But Catherine and I recognize that perhaps in this type of murder, law enforcement could be proactive if we understood the type of offender we had. And then we said, well, boy, lots of research in serial murder, lots of research in mass murder, categories in both, but spree murder, like no research,
No
none,
categories.
no categories. And we're like, gosh, maybe we should do something about it.
Yeah, we're
And
just going to do an article.
right, exactly. That's right. I forgot. We were just
Yeah.
talking about writing an article about it. And then Catherine goes, well, why don't we write a book? And
Yeah,
I'm like,
I had an editor at the time, and I told him about what we were doing because we kept coming up with more and more cases, especially internationally. We had,
right.
We were creating a database like no one had done before. So the editor was interested in having this kind of resource.
Yeah. It's interesting because then once we decided to do that, I started, looking everywhere for books on spree murder, and I was buying them from Alibris and these book sites where you can buy used books, and I had like a dozen of these books, and I read them. And what was fascinating is that not one of these books, even though they were being written about spree murder, or sometimes they were called rampage murders, in none of them did they actually ever define what they meant by spree murder, which I thought was so interesting, right? They were writing a book about it, but they never defined it. And then as you go through it, you realize that most of the cases aren't really spree murders. There's a bunch of serial murders in there. There's some mass murders.
Mhm.
I'm like, nobody's really figured this out. And so Catherine and I spent a long time figuring out categories. And the way that we did that is just by looking at cases and going, so what are the hallmarks of this case? So after 10 or 20 cases, we'd say, okay, these look like this could be a category. And then, 30 or 40 cases later, you go, well, this category doesn't really work, but this would work. And then 100 cases later, and then 200. And I think what we have, like 400.
Yeah, somewhere. And we keep doing it because every time there's another case,
Right.
we
So
talk to each other. What do you think about this one? Where does it fit?
we keep collecting, and we've been collecting them for years, ever since the book came out. But there's no other book out there that addresses spree murder. No other book that defines it the way that Catherine and I have defined it. And we have this huge collection of cases from 43 countries,
Right.
and we have categorized all of them. And I would say, because I did read a review on the book, and somebody said, well, there is, it seems like, you could have more than one category. And we totally agree with that. What we tried to do was like, what is the category that is where this case fits the best? There's overlap, of course. In a lot of these cases, there's overlap, but all of the cases, I mean, by the time we were done, we had what, seven categories, and then several subcategories within
Subcategories, yeah.
those. Um, but every single case that we have in the book, and every case that we have collected since, we have been able to fit very cleanly into one of those categories, which means that I think, we never are at a point where, gosh, this doesn't really fit into anything we have. Everyone is fit in. So it's, I think it's probably sort of the seminal textbook on spree murder. There just isn't anything else out
No,
there.
there isn't.
And all this came out of polite dinner conversation.
Yeah. Right. I forgot about that, about the article that we were,
You and Dr.
we were talking about,
Safarik
just
over dinner, if you think it's
watching
polite.
writing an artitle.
Exactly.
And then, of
It
course,
sounds like the
Catherine,
bar
like
at a writer's conference.
86 books, said, well, let's write a book. And I'm like, look, hey, let's do. That's great.
I will tell you, one time we were having breakfast at a diner, and he pulls out his computer with these really graphic crime scene photos, and there's families all around us. He's completely oblivious to
Yeah, sometimes I forget. It's because it's, for me, it's just, it's what I do, and I forget that
Sure.
you have to be sensitive to people that are around you. But
that
but
you got to be careful,
I mean,
what you talk about at the dinner table too. People look at you like, what is wrong with you?
Oh yeah. Well,
Oh,
when
yeah,
you get, I was just down in South Carolina lecturing for the Department of Justice at the National Advocacy Center to about 180 law enforcement investigators from around the country. But when you're out to dinner with a group of people like that, and you're all just talking about stuff, and you don't realize that, this is what we all deal with, but people around you they're hearing your conversation.
Yeah, they're
and going,
civilians.
"Oh,
Exactly.
who are these people?"
Same way with cops and doctors. I mean, you got to be careful. People say, well, what, that's not funny. Oh yeah, it was. You had to be there.
Yeah,
It was really very, very funny. Yeah, but the guy died. Yeah, but it was funny. And that kind of,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's true. You do have to be sensitive.
Yeah.
But it's
Anything else you want
it
to
is.
chat about? Do you want to tell us about? Catherine, you have any questions?
you want to talk about anything you're working on now that?
Yeah.
So I am, let's see it.
If you can.
Well, I'm in a week, I'm testifying in this case, but I did, well, I probably shouldn't say. It's a serial murder case of elderly females. It's a fascinating case, really. But yeah, I'll just maybe leave that until I'm finished testifying. I see cases that, cases that I really find interesting are equivocal death cases, where when you get a murder case, you got a murder case, right? There's no question about it. But when you get a case, and I've worked on some really interesting cases, equivocal cases, where the manner of death is in question, right? And once you look at it, you can narrow it down to usually two, maybe three. But I did this fascinating case out of San Francisco. It was the death of a young man who was a French American citizen. And he died from stabbing injuries. Only a couple.
Three,
right. Huge amount of blood in this scene. This is really, it's a fascinating scene, and there's movement around in this apartment and in the kitchen. And blood spatter analysis really became very important in this case. Um, but the San Francisco PD had investigated this, and they're like, well, it was, I think, listed as undetermined. And they were like, we're not really, hey, this is what the San Francisco medical examiner said. It's undetermined, and that's where we're going to leave it. Then the French, were going, no, no. The parents of who lived in France said, no, it's a homicide. This is clearly a homicide. And so we have a treaty with France that allows their investigators, if they want, to come over and investigate the death of one of their citizens, which is what happened. And so there was a team of about 4 or 5 investigators that came over. San Francisco PD hosted them, and they went through everything and wrote their reports. And they came up with the fact that this was a homicide. And I ended up getting the case. Like, can you please put this case to bed? Can we make some kind of an assessment? What do we have here? And it took me, I don't know, better part of 6 or 7 months going through so much information and then writing a detailed report on this. But my conclusion was that it was a suicide. But you look at the scene and you go, wow, it doesn't look like it. But once you start looking at the forensic dynamics and his victimology and the things that he said, in the past, um, and the absence of other types of forensics, like where is the person who did this? Where is their footprints, their fingerprints in blood? Because blood is everywhere in this scene. It was a fascinating case and a difficult case to do because there was so much information. Then I had to address all of the French reports, um, and some of them were, I just went point by point and said, yeah, this isn't accurate, but they're challenging, right? Because you have to make a case. You have to make a case for what is consistent and inconsistent with a particular uh, manner of death, which is not what in a homicide you don't have to, right? Because you know what you've got. So you're just working off that. But then you say, well, what's consistent with homicide? What's inconsistent that I see here? What's consistent with suicide? What's inconsistent? Um, or natural death. I try to rule out the others.
Right.
It's easy. Like in that case, natural death was easy. A considered accident, but not really. But I think blood spatter played a really critical role in that case. In other cases, some people. So I always say it's the interaction between the victim and the offender in the scene. Most of the time, it's that dynamic between your victim and offender that is the critical piece. But sometimes the scene itself plays a really important role. And there was a case that I did up in California, Northern California, Jenner, California, where a young couple was murdered on the beach and they were in their sleeping bags. And nothing else was going on at the scene that nobody knew they were going to be there. That was really important to understand that, were they followed from someplace, but nobody knew. They didn't have any plans. They just came to this beach and parked on the side of the road, decided that they would camp down here. And they found this shelter. It was like a driftwood shelter that people had been building over the years. But when you look at the scene, it's very interesting because they're both in sleeping bags, which are connected together. They're each shot one time with this unusual weapon, which is it's a rifle, but it's a very unusual caliber. You just don't see rifles like this. And all of their stuff, nothing is touched. There's no theft of any property. There's no they're not touched. There's no sexual assault. There's no manipulation of the bodies. Nothing is, it's like the person walked up, shot them, and then left. That was it. But the scene became so critical because you had to understand that where they were on this beach, you could not just walk to it. It, and this was in the middle of the night. And you had to walk down this face cliff. First, you had to, there's a little turnout on the road. And then there was a long path through the weeds that came to the top of the cliff. And then you had to walk down this cliff face to the beach, but it walked the opposite direction of where they were. And then you had to circle around, and then you had to navigate all maybe like close to a half mile among all the driftwood to get to where they were in the middle of the night to just shoot them and then to leave. And I thought the scene was so critical here because it tells you that whoever the shooter is has a personal connection to this location.
Right.
And whatever happened here, he was offended by them being there. There's not supposed to be any camping on the beach. And then next to this structure, this was where people would come during the day, but nobody would stay at night. And I'm just like, this is a personal affront to him. He's not interested in stealing anything. And maybe he'd had a conversation with them earlier. It could have been as simple as like, you can't camp here. Right. And they're like, well, we don't have a place to camp, so we're going to camp here. It could have been that. But whatever it was caused him to get a gun, come back in the middle of the night and kill two people he'd never met, didn't know, for no other reason except to kill them. So sometimes the scene, and I've had other cases like this, the scene becomes a really crucial piece, and it can get missed by law enforcement because they're focused on the victims and the homicide, right? They're focused on what happened right here in this little space of the beach. But if you pull out to that 10,000 foot view and you start to consider the scene, you realize, wow, this scene tells you, and where its location and how you access it tells you a lot about your guy, the shooter. So those kind of cases, I think, the subtlety of recognizing little things like that.
Yeah.
And I just had another case that was, I think, very
Well, what was
interesting.
the outcome of that case?
So, I mean, I wrote an assessment. The offender was not discovered until I think it was years later.
Years
I
later.
think so.
Yeah,
Yes.
years later, and because the cops were sure that they could identify this rifle. It was so rare. They were going to the manufacturer like, where was this rifle sold? And it had to be somebody who lived right in that area because how would you know this place? This was so isolated. I mean, when you look at it in an overview, this is just a tiny turnout. Like you wouldn't even know there was a path that went down to the beach at this turnout. So somebody had to be very, very familiar with it. And I thought it would make for a very small pool of suspects, which I think it did. But eventually they did identify a guy who owned that rifle and who was arrested. And I believe he was convicted in those cases.
Yeah, I think he killed somebody else somewhere else too.
Yes. Right. But, and I wrote an assessment and I wrote all this up about how important this place was to him. But, he wasn't arrested in, a time frame. And that's, and sometimes these cases, when we're involved in the unit, we don't get feedback because we provide the service, we provide our analysis. Sometimes we provide a report. But oftentimes there's not follow-up on the case. We move on to another case. And then like this case, years later, it gets resolved, but nobody calls and says, hey, your assessment, this guy fit your assessment. We just don't hear about that.
Hmm.
You
But
know,
I
it
had
was odd though. I used the Jenner Beach crime scene for my one of my crime scene exercises.
yes,
It was
you
the
do.
same time Mark was coming. I had no idea he had done this assessment at all. And I was showing him proudly my crime scene setup. He goes, I profiled that.
Yeah, that was interesting, right? Yep. I mean, it's great. Catherine and I clicking on
Yeah.
all
Yeah,
cylinders together there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Because those cases are so interesting, right? Because you just think, what is going on here?
Yeah.
Like, because in most crime scenes, there's some motivation that's,
sure.
you have an
It's a
obvious
spouse,
motive.
it's your drug dealer, it's your,
Yeah,
coworker. Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
jealousy, it's
Almost always. Yeah,
revenge,
yeah.
it's financial gain, it's sexual assault, it's something, right? Typically, you can tell at the scene, but when you have something like that, you just go, "What? What's
Now,
going
Herb
on?"
Mullen did that. He encountered these four guys camping in a spot he didn't think they belonged, and he shot them all.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Crazy world.
yeah, it's very interesting. I had an interesting case in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, um, Iredell County. So it's a double homicide of an older couple in their home. But so victimology becomes really important because here, this guy, he never allowed anybody into his house that he didn't know or trust. And he initially the shooter initially tries to shoot him when they're sitting in like a living room area, grazes him, misses a couple shots. He gets up and runs. The shooter follows, shoots him. He ends up dying in the kitchen. Wife is in the back bedroom, hears the shots, and she starts coming down the hallway. She comes to the husband's because he's right there in front of her, and then she gets shot. But each of them are only shot one time, and they're not shot in locations that would normally be fatal. It just so happened that these single gunshot wounds uh, ruptured or severed a critical artery. But lots of people get shot in those areas and they survive. There's no problem. So the detectives came in 2005 to the unit and presented this case. And, you know, we looked at it and then they left. And not 30 days later, another double homicide about 30 miles away, another couple that, very private. Um, the guy just, he didn't transact business in his house unless he knew you. But here it was a different crime scene. This guy was very security conscious. He owned a grocery store. He'd been robbed a couple times at his house because he used to bring the money back and forth. He had a gun under his front seat of his car. He had security lights all around the whole place. And yet somebody came up to his door at the garage, knocked on the door. He opened the door, and as soon as he opened the door, he got shot. Again, a single gunshot. The offender walked in and then made their way to the back of the house. Wife had heard the gunshot. She gets up from a desk. She makes it like 6 feet. She barely makes it to the door entrance, and she gets shot like in the shoulder. One shot. And that's it. There's no theft. There was money there. There was lots of valuables. No theft. And again, four people dead, four single gunshot wounds in areas that you like she got shot in the shoulder. It just so happened it went through here and severed one of the subclavian veins.
So there's subclavian artery. Yeah.
Yeah, subclavian artery, it just with these weird,
Yeah.
injuries. But he lived for a while and he moved around in the room. And when I teach this case, I show like this is where he's going. He's moving over to the couch and he's leaning and he's bleeding on the couch. And then he moves to this part of the couch. And then he sits on the floor. And now he's sitting up on the floor because I can show void patterns in his clothing where the blood is dripping from here down, but it misses this part because he's sitting up, and where it's on his toes. And then he finally, he goes back, and then he's moving his hands. And I looked at these crime scenes and I'm like, you know, you I think you have a female offender. They were like, what? I'm like, I think you have a female offender. I think she's older and she's got mental health problems. And they're like, well, why would you say she has mental health problems? I'm like, because especially in the second double murders, and these two couples didn't know each other, which is a good way you can link if you have a suspect that is attached to both, right? But these two couples, they didn't know each other and didn't interact with one another. So that was a bit helpful. But I said, here's the thing, and it's very subtle. So the shooter shoots. I said, so here's the distinction. The shooter is interested in shooting, not killing. She shoots the guy at the door, and then she walks in and walks past him. Now he's moved over to the couch. He's standing there because she has to make her way all the way back through the kitchen to this hallway where the wife is, who's probably calling out, and then shoots the wife. Now, the wife's wound isn't immediately fatal. She's bleeding out. She probably lived 10, 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But the shooter then walks out of the house. And the guy is probably still leaning on the couch, or maybe he's sitting on the floor. And I said, the shooter is not interested in killing, only in shooting. And I said, that's a really interesting distinction that you have to make. Because when the cops get there, right, what do they have? They have 4 dead people. So they're thinking of it in terms of 4 homicides. Yes, 4 homicides, but not intended homicides, intended shootings. And then the offender walks out, walks past the guy. The guy could survive.
And not
Identify
worried
the
about
shooter.
witnesses.
Right.
Yeah.
Not worried about
Yeah.
witnesses. That all 4 of these people in another life, they could have all survived and then
identified her.
the
Yeah.
shooter. So I said, I think you've got because they're comfortable with somebody coming into their house. I said, it's probably a female. She's older, like probably around their age. So like late 60s, 70s, and she has mental health problems. That's what I said. And 750 leads later, they identify a woman. And they recover the tennis shoes that she was wearing because she didn't get rid of them. Right?
No.
She didn't care. She
No.
wasn't.
Yeah.
She wasn't trying to get rid of them. Right? They recovered the gun, and she never went to trial because she was. It was determined that she was not guilty by reason of insanity. She went to a mental health facility. But I mean, you could just see it, but you didn't really see it if you just looked at them as homicides, like somebody
Right.
came in and killed these 4 people. But that subtlety of recognizing from the way the blood stains were and the length of time it would take him to move around there, that she left while he was probably still sitting on the floor,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe even standing at the couch. Just walked right by him. I'm
It
like,
sounds like she was almost playing a movie in her head and she was just in the movie. And in the movies, you shoot somebody and they die. In real life, you got to shoot somebody 9 times. I mean, really. But it sounds like that's almost what she was doing, that she walks in, bang, okay, bang, and I got to go get groceries or something. It's,
yeah, I mean,
I mean, it's just bizarre.
It's bizarre. But I mean, when I teach that case, the point I try to instill is like you have to look at the dynamics of things here. Like, how did things happen chronologically and how do they happen in time? Because yes, this event is happening after this event, but the time frame is really expanded.
Right.
Right. So what does that tell you? when the temporal aspect doesn't match up with the chronological aspect, right? That whole thing, because I was like, yeah, this guy's probably alive for at least 10 minutes
Mm-hmm.
and she's long gone,
Yeah.
right? So clearly killing him wasn't the point.
Right.
And I imagine the other two people in the first double homicide, they probably were alive for a period of time too. Again,
Sure. Yeah.
injuries,
It takes a while to
you
bleed to
can
death.
live. You
Yeah.
can live. I know in the movies, like you get shot once,
Now, one
they
time you're
die.
down
Boom,
and your
they're
hair's
dead. I
purple.
mean,
Yeah.
they're just dead. But
Yeah. Yeah.
in real life, people just don't die that
What
fast.
did she have a relationship with either of the couples? And without you
She
said they didn't
did.
have a relation, but so
So both
they
of these
yeah, okay.
guys were what they call country bankers. So they loan money to people, but
Right.
they just keep that in their head. They don't write anything down, right?
Right. Right.
And so
Wow.
it was related to these loans that she had gotten from these two guys, but there was no way for law enforcement to know about those because,
Sure.
you know, because that was just in their heads, right? So, but they did, once they started, and once I said, like, I think you're looking for a female.
Wow.
I said, find a female that has a connection to both these people because they don't have a connection to each other. So that's good.
Right.
So find a connection, find an older female who's got mental health problems who has a connection to both these people. And that's how they proceeded in the investigation.
Good case.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
it's
Very
just,
cool case.
it's those subtleties that I think make those kind of cases
Sure.
fascinating.
Sure. Absolutely.
So now that I've completely monopolized the
No.
conversation,
That's what this
This
was
is your
all
show
about. And
today.
I
but
tell you what, I know our viewers will feel the same way, and our listeners on the podcast is they will have to devour this 2 or 3 times because there's a lot of stuff here, and there's a whole lot to think about here too. And especially, if you're a crime writer or a true crime reader, there's so much here you need to know, that you're going to go back and do it again. So, and
yeah.
listen to it, watch it again.
Well, I don't know if you know Alan Jacobson, but he's a good friend of
Yeah, yeah,
mine.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so, and I've consulted with Alan on all
Yeah.
of his Karen Vale books
Right,
because
right.
she's an FBI criminal profiler. So, I read those and I'm like, okay, this is what this is, I think, how she would react, and
Mhm.
this is what she'd be looking for
Sure.
because, you're looking to make these realistic and,
Hmm.
you like your writer's workshop, you have experts
Right,
like Catherine in there to say, okay, this is how you need to think about this, right? And
right.
this is how you need to frame this kind of killer, right? And you need to think about, are we dealing with a psychopath and what does that mean? And, how did they get into this scene? And, why would they using this weapon? And why are they engaged in this behavior? Yeah, those are all important things that make your novel and what you're writing about realistic.
Yeah, and I know you've done some work with some TV shows like CSI Las Vegas and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done a few of those too over the years, and
Yeah.
the screenwriters have an interesting take on the world and
Well,
on fact and fiction, but they
it's
got a story to
difficult.
tell.
It's
Exactly.
difficult, right?
Yes.
Because you've got 43 minutes to tell
Right.
a story
Right.
that's interesting, but you're also trying to keep it forensically real,
Right.
right?
Trying.
Trying.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, when in Criminal Minds, when 5 profilers get on the G5 and fly to a crime scene, I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, that never happens ever.
Or ever
I
will.
fly coach in the back of the plane, usually by myself. If I'm
Yeah.
lucky, one other person can come with me. But, yeah, that's the way it is, right?
Sure.
But, and they don't get to do all those things.
No.
We don't have that wide range of, all those aspects. But
Yeah.
you've got to make a show interesting and you try to
Absolutely.
keep it.
It's entertainment.
It's entertainment, but you're also, you don't just make things up,
Right.
right? Because people are that watch crime dramas are pretty
Yeah.
astute about what you can and cannot do. So you should make an effort to make it realistic,
Yeah. Yeah.
and entertaining in 43 minutes. Right. So,
Exactly. Well, Mark, this has been fantastic. I mean, better
yeah,
than
thank you,
fantastic.
Doug.
And I
I've
really,
enjoyed it.
really,
Thank you,
really
Catherine,
appreciate it.
Yeah.
for inviting me on. Both of
And
you,
we'll
I
have to do
appreciate
this
it.
again down the road
Love to. Yeah,
and the
absolutely.
stuff like that. So we'll sign off here. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening. This has been Criminal Mischief, the art and science of crime fiction on the Outliers YouTube channel and podcast series. And we'll be back with more shows and more interviews and more fun. So keep having fun, keep writing, keep reading, and try not to get caught.